Is there anyone from the design team that I missed that's here? Great, so we didn't print these out for you today, but hopefully we've got some badges on, or just yell, hey you, and we'll try to answer. Here is what we're going to be talking about today. We are going to run through some of the usual overview and introductions just to remind us things about where we are in the process and what our objectives are. We want to go over a few things about what we've been hearing in the last CPC, as well as the community design workshop that we had a month ago. We have put out on the table an updated vision statement and updates from the guiding principles that tried to incorporate feedback that we heard. What we'd like to ask of all of you is not necessarily to read them all right now so that you can't listen, but to start to think about them and read them in moments, and then leave comments for us. That just turned off?
I just turned it down a little. Should have turned it off.
Oh yeah, okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's so much better. I felt like I was yelling. Okay, as we've been doing with each of our CPCs, we have a little bit of a primer on an aspect of how we design. This week, our primer is going to be on the issue of carbon, and specifically talking about embodied carbon versus operational carbon, and some terminology and some considerations. And then we're going to get into the site options, and we'll turn those boards around. And we're going to do some interactive, talking to each other and post-it notes like we've done in the past. So our objectives for today are to continue to get feedback as you read through the updates to the vision statement and the guiding principles. See if they're starting to resonate, and see if you're starting to see them reflected in the site approaches. As we've said in the past, our objective moving forward is going to be to bring forward one recommended option to the school board. Today we're going to be bringing you, we've narrowed it down from 3 last time, we're going to bring you 2 this time, and then from all of your feedback, we're going to start to try and figure out how do we take the best of everything and narrow it down to 1 to bring to you next time. So as you think about what you're seeing today, ask yourself questions like, what does it feel like? Is it reflecting those values of Ida B. Wells High School? How does it work in terms of what we've tried to improve and some of the differences between the schemes you'll see have to do with the arrival and the connection to and from Capitol Highway, and arrival and access to the pool, and then the vehicular and pedestrian access to and from the site. So those are going to be part of your the questions regarding functionality. But just as a reminder, what our job is a modernization is about the physical space, so how it looks and feels, and about the pieces of the building that will support teaching and learning, infrastructure, and the spaces. It's actually not about how it will be operating. That'll be Aisha's problem and her team. It's also not about what kinds of classes specifically go on, but there's obviously a need for there to be flexibility. So we need to design a building for 100 years that can function really well when it opens, and that then is adaptable as it moves forward. But your input in particular gives us the feedback that we can't get any other way about qualitative questions about experience, what might make it unique and really reflective of this community and the culture of this school. Okay, where are we in the process? You'll notice we got CPC 4, wait, no really, CPC 4 is there, thank you Ice Storm, but here's where we are on the process. We are from this meeting going to start moving into more of an option of really digging into recommendations and moving towards the F&O committee, which is the Facilities and Operation Subcommittee of the school board, to start to give them an idea of where we're at. And then that meeting is a precursor to what we'll ultimately put together for the board packet and recommendations. OSM team, anything you want to add to that? No? It's the 4th time we've done it, so I'm starting to get the hang of that one. Okay, big picture. You've all seen this before if you've been to this meeting, but if you haven't, this is where we're at in the big picture of the process. There was a comprehensive planning master phase that was done prior to the pandemic. We're in a comprehensive planning phase now that is really starting to dig into the approach to the site and put together a recommended budget and approach. From there, the next phase of this project will involve actually starting design. Schematic design and design development are our terms for phases that we use to start to make the big picture stuff that we're doing today. We start to get more and more detailed about it. We ultimately create a set of drawings that tells a contractor how to build it. Sometimes those are called permit documents. That's what they're called on this screen. And then ultimately it's built. So typically the design phase takes somewhere between 18 and 24 months. And then typically the construction of a project of this size will take 24 to 36 months, depending on a lot of decisions that we make along the way. I know that that's pretty vague, but we're at a vague stage where we've got a lot of big questions, and we're just trying to answer some of the most basic ones. Okay, what have we heard so far to date? We have had a number of meetings. This is the fourth with you. We've also had 2 community design workshops that have happened where we presented essentially the same kind of material as what you all have seen. These are very small, and I don't expect you all to read them, but if anyone downloads this later, these bullet points are on there for you to be able to reference in the future and to remind yourself of the 3 schemes that we looked at last time. But we talked about 3 schemes that were trying to have 3 different approaches to the site. And some of the big things that we heard was in this first scheme, we felt like the feedback was that it was very successful in trying to get some of the elements into a small amount of footprint so that we could have the most area on the site for other things. But it didn't have a good connection to Capitol Highway. There was not enough parking near Capitol Highway. And most importantly, the thing that we took away probably most from this one is that the feedback was it felt too compact, too tall, and the internal courtyard felt too confining. Didn't feel successful. There were a few other things on there. Feel free to look at that later. But those were some of the biggest takeaways we heard on that scheme and that we used. On the second scheme, which we had called lift because of the way it kind of lifted up as it went up the hill, that was another one where we kept the track and field where it was, and then we had the building actually spread out a little more going up the hill. The big pieces of feedback we heard on the successes was that people appreciated that it minimized the western sun that we had talked about that was hot and had a lot of glare. And that the 2 or 3 stories was better for a neighborhood scale than the 4 stories of the other one. But it had a weak connection to Capitol Highway, and the feeling was that it was too close to Reiki Elementary School. And it felt like it was almost looming overhead, and having high school students right next to the youngest students did not feel good. And then on the third scheme, that was the one where we called it Connect because of the way it was trying to connect Capitol Highway and Hillsdale to the Vermont side of the school. In that one, in order to do that, we had to reorient the track and field. In that one, we also said, what would happen if we relocated the pool and where might we put it? And in that particular case, we had relocated the pool to this southeast corner of the site. So the successes is people appreciated the strong connection to Capitol Highway and the ideal or the optimal orientation of the track and field being north and south. They appreciated that parking was convenient to both ends of the building as opposed to on this one, the parking was mostly concentrated on one side. On this one, it was on both sides. And then again, 2 or 3 stories. The challenges for this one and the biggest ones we took away was don't move the pool. That was pretty clear in all of the discussions. And especially don't move the pool further away from Hillsdale, but don't move the pool because it will cost money and we don't think it's necessary. That was, I think, our biggest takeaway there. And then the other challenge is that it is more disruptive. It moves more site elements. It does mean that there will be programs, especially anything that use the track and field, that would be unavailable during construction, and that is an impact. So those are the biggest takeaways that we took from the last schemes that we looked at. Is there anything that you feel like we missed in terms of, big takeaways or pieces of feedback that you wanted to make sure that we heard? Because this is what we use to bring forward the next set. Anyone? Nailed it. Right.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Out of those 3
I would say the second and the third generally had more positive feedback than the first. The first and the second had some similarities though. But we were not asking people to pick one. So we really were trying to think of successes and challenges for each one. And they both had pretty equal successes and challenges depending on what your priorities are. Read those if you haven't. And as we start moving forward into the rest of the presentation, consider how are those guiding principles still feeling like they're representing the spirit of Ida B. Wells as both a name and an inspiration, and the spirit of this school's culture. And then does that vision statement seem to summarize the vision of the school? You don't need to raise your hand, but if you could mark down comments or leave Post-its and leave them for us, that would be really fabulous. Oh, and then here's the vision statement. Okay, I thought we took those out. We're gonna start talking about carbon. Corey?
All right. Yes, go ahead.
There's an open table up front if anyone is having a hard time seeing the screen or hearing. Table with Post-its and pens right here.
Oh yeah, this looks like a great table if anyone's interested. There's nothing wrong with it. All right, my name is Corey Squire. I am Sustainability Director at Bohr Architects, and I'll be the Sustainability Lead on this project. Last time I was here for one of these meetings, we talked about building orientation, and we're going to share more about some of the outcomes of the massings based on those ideas. But the next topic, and this closely relates to the PPS Climate Action and Response Plan, is about carbon. So this has to do with carbon emissions, and I'll just kind of give a brief primer and then some ideas of what we're trying to do, and we can kind of pull this into the discussion around the schemes. All right, so specifically we're talking about carbon and design. Carbon is this big topic that touches lots of aspects of society and life. Our opportunity for this project is to design in a way that reduces carbon emissions as much as possible. So here's the primer on the carbon cycle. So there's carbon in the atmosphere, right? That carbon is absorbed by plants, that becomes part of the biomass, becomes trees, food, whatever else. Animals might eat plant matter, pull carbon into their own bodies. Eventually, plants and animals are going to die, decompose. As they decompose, that carbon goes back to the atmosphere. That's called the carbon cycle. And for a very long period of time, up until about 100, 150 years ago, the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere was about 350 parts per million. And that carbon moves through the atmosphere, through the biosphere, but it basically kind of maintained that level. Right, so what's happened since then is some of those animals and plants that have decayed back in the Carboniferous period, hundreds of millions of years ago, became fossil fuels that got stored underneath the surface of the earth. We've more recently begun mining that, burning that for energy, power buildings, power transportation, generate electricity, and then that carbon is re-entering the atmosphere, so rejoining the carbon cycle. So today, the atmospheric carbon is 421 parts per million, so significantly higher than it was a few decades ago, a few centuries ago. So what does that mean for us? And it means that we have the impacts of climate change to deal with. This building that we're designing will be designed for a world with a much higher carbon concentration than previous buildings, and that means very specific things from a resiliency standpoint, but it also means that we have a responsibility to decrease the impact of this building as much as possible. So here's an image of the heat wave that we had in 2021. That's one of the major impacts. We'll have more of those. We had smoke, wildfires. So these seem like global issues, but they are very much have local impacts. Now we often think about carbon emissions. We see exhaust pipes, we see highways, and many people think that the majority of carbon emissions come from the transportation system, but actually buildings contribute to 42%, which is the largest single kind of source of carbon emissions globally. A lot of that has to do with powering buildings, but also generating the materials that are used to construct buildings. All right, so carbon is a bad thing in the atmosphere, we know that. Well, not entirely. There's a good amount of carbon. Too much carbon in the atmosphere is a bad thing. But how bad is it? And it's important to understand how bad the carbon is so that we can make informed decisions. The social cost of carbon set by the EPA is $190 per ton. What this means is that every ton of carbon that's released in the atmosphere has a societal cost of $190. How do we pay that cost, right? Increased medical expenses is one option. Climate adaptation. If we have a climate event and your pipes freeze and they burst and there's flood damage, that's a cost to society based on climate change, right? Crop failures, loss of ecosystem services, people die because of this. So it's a big deal, but we want to use this number so that we can understand the impact that we're having and approach it in an informed way. So carbon emissions from buildings are dependent on design decisions, and specifically design decisions related to window systems, to comfort systems like HVAC, heating and cooling and ventilation, structural systems, the materials that we're using to construct our buildings, how we're using the land on site, and then transportation. All right, so there's two types of carbon, or buildings in kind of release carbon in the atmosphere in two different ways: operational carbon and embodied carbon, right? Operational carbon is we burn fossil fuels to generate electricity, to power lights, to power air conditioning, to power heat. The other form of carbon emissions is we burn fossil fuels to kind of mine, manufacture, and transport building materials, right? Operational carbon powers building systems. Embodied carbon is the carbon at the beginning of the project that is released in the atmosphere to generate everything that the building is being made of. So we deal with these two sources of carbon differently when we design. Operational carbon is decreased with energy efficiency, right? We always talk about energy efficiency related to sustainability, related to carbon, and also offsetting energy through solar PVs. Embodied carbon is addressed through building materials. What we want to do is use more wood. Wood is carbon pulled from the atmosphere that we can store inside of buildings. Less concrete and steel, which are heavy materials that are very resource intensive and energy intensive to produce, and then heavy to transport. So operational energy does not equal carbon. Here's a picture of the Bonneville Dam. A lot of our energy in this region is generated through hydropower, which is clean, which means that compared to other parts of the country, if we run some light bulbs, we're generating less carbon emissions than, let's say, West Virginia, where their grid is powered by burning coal. What that means from a design standpoint is here's an idealized kind of view of carbon. This actually shifted a little bit. This should be 2050 over here. But idealized kind of graph of a typical benchmark building of the scale of IW Wells. Operational carbon is a one-time expenditure at the beginning of the project when it's constructed, and operational carbon is kind of an annual expenditure on top of that. Now, our grid is supposed to be carbon neutral by 2040 and getting cleaner every year until then. So what that means is by the year 2050, which is an important date for the PPS Climate Action Plan, about 80% of the carbon emissions associated with the new building will be embodied rather than operational. Means if we wanted to prioritize, embodied carbon is where we'd prioritize to address carbon. And that goes back to this idea of more wood, less concrete and steel. One way of doing that is a wood structural system, which is a strategy that has other benefits besides carbon, but something that we'll definitely explore for this project. So just to finish up, the PPS Climate Action Plan is a broad kind of document. There's a lot of things touched on it. We've discussed it in the past, and we'll discuss it more in the future. And there's a board that we can look into the specific items related. But at a high level, the goal is to reduce greenhouse gases by 50% by 2030, using the 2018-2019 school year as a baseline, and then to reach zero emissions by 2040, which is only 17 years away. The plan is divided into 3 pillars, and each of those pillars are broken into goals, and under each goals are a series of commitments. So pillar number 1, reduce environmental impacts and costs, and goal 1.1, which is the majority of the issues related to carbon reduction, and they're all listed on a board, so we'll be able to discuss that in a minute, or you'll be able to actually go and kind of interact with it. PPS will design and construct new low-carbon schools and renovations that are energy efficient, resilient, and adaptive. And each of those 7 items underneath that goal are that we will kind of comply with for this project are listed over there. And that's all I had on carbon. Oh, and one more thing. Next meeting, we're gonna talk about indoor air quality. No, before we get there, any questions on carbon? We can do this quickly. Yes?
We're not gonna get away with not using concrete.
No, there will be concrete on this project.
Will it be the currently newer style of concrete manufacturer that's gonna be a lot less carbon, and is that happening now? And
Exactly. Well, there
what's
is.
the cost of doing that?
So, good question and good point. We will have concrete in this building, right? There's no way of eliminating concrete in a modern building. Concrete is a major source of carbon emissions. So we want to do two things. We want to decrease the quantity of concrete that we have in the project, and we also want to choose concrete that results in less carbon emissions, right? There are different admixtures. There's different ways of making a concrete formula that are more or less environmental efficient. It's something we'll have to plan for, not necessarily a cost add, but an important point that we'll be focusing on.
Oh, sorry to follow up.
Yes,
When it,
no, go
when
ahead.
it goes to the school board, there's gonna be increased cost for doing it the newer right way.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily?
not necessarily
Okay.
at
I was
all,
wondering if
yeah.
there was part of the offset of the budget and meeting the target, that if the costs are more upfront, it's okay to do because it meets our long-term goal.
Overall, there should be no reason, that the more sustainable school costs more than a business as usual school, right? But what it does mean is we have to be very specific in our intention. We have to design in a specific way. We have to plan ahead. And we have to set goals and know what we're doing. But no, we're not gonna be kind of blowing the budget because we want a sustainable school. A sustainable school will provide lots of benefits, and should not come with a cost premium, with the exception of a few systems, just because they might be new, right? Like solar PV, right? If we want solar PV, we're gonna add that, but that's already required by code. But if we want a more energy efficient building, we can do that through orienting the building this way rather than this way. Same number of windows, same cost, but different impact.
Thank you.
Can I add one thing to
Yes.
that? There are a few elements that we've been learning from the climate response policy, doing an all-electric building without natural gas. There are some systems that right now are a bit more expensive, and we're just recognizing that there are some cost premiums that are relatively small right now. So what we're trying to do is make the smart decisions of what can we do to make it better. It's by far not gonna be perfect yet, but all of these things move us towards that 2050 deadline. There are a couple of things though, especially related to the all electric, that have some cost impacts.
Yes, and we don't have a huge amount of time, so one or two more questions? Yes.
And you can put post-it notes up there for more
Yes,
questions.
of course.
You're probably gonna use heat pumps.
We're gonna use heat pumps.
Are you gonna use, I don't know, geothermal is the right word,
Ground source
Right.
heat. We can explore ground source heat as an option. It is a very efficient way of kind of pulling the stable temperature beneath the ground. What I will say is that's an interesting cost question. There's rebates in the Inflation Reduction Act to encourage the use of ground source heat pumps that may or may not still be available and may or may not be available for this project, something we will look into. The other piece is that air-to-air heat pumps are much more efficient than they were even 5 years ago. So the efficiency differential between air source and ground source heat pumps is actually getting smaller and smaller, which means that it might not be necessary to go with the ground source heat pumps. But it's definitely something we'll explore, both from a cost standpoint and from an efficiency standpoint.
You put transportation on there, you didn't talk about it.
Yes, so transportation, so part of the climate action plan, I didn't plan on talking about this, but I'll touch on it briefly. Part of the climate action plan is addressing decreasing carbon emissions associated with transportation to and from the schools, right? So the PPS has a fleet of vehicles that are gonna be transitioned to electric vehicles over X number of years. One thing that we do wanna look at is issues around parking, issues around electric car charging, electric bikes. How do we make this campus more accessible from public transportation, from cyclists? So looking at different ways of decreasing the carbon emissions associated with students, faculty, staff, parents coming to school.
I, for one, would really like to be involved in the discussions of those alternatives.
So one thing that we're gonna do, we're gonna have a sustainability visioning charrette for this group, where we're gonna kind of dig into all of these topics in great detail.
After
So
we
we're-
start design.
After we start design, yeah, we're doing primers during this pre-design phase, but when we get into design, we're gonna jump into this in a lot of detail. Yes.
And don't forget, we design the physical building. We don't get to design whether or not people actually come by car or bike. We can put things in place that try to make it desirable, try to make it feasible and better. But ultimately, there's also a cultural shift that we all, as a society, will have to do with it. That is kind of outside our scope of work. So, but we'll keep working on it. As you can see, we're all, our PPS team, our entire design team is really passionate about this as a building for the next 100 years. We want to get as much right as we possibly can within kind of the reasonable bounds. When it comes to some of the building systems like ground source heat pumps, we also need to consider that this is only one building within 89 different properties that PPS has and a very limited staff to maintain the building. So that's another consideration. The longevity of a building is really partly determined by whether or not you can maintain them. So we have to weigh a lot of different options. So we're gonna move on, but put more questions about carbon or anything related to that onto the two different boards that we have, and we can start to send out more information about that.
And I'll stand by one of these two boards at some point when we get up if you have any more questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, site design options. So Steffi said today we brought 2 ideas, narrowed down from 3. We're really excited to share the details with you. I'm going to kind of start us off with just a series of diagrams that really try to help us understand all of the major factors that are existent on this site, because although it's a really large site, it's actually kind of a tight site when you start to really look at all of the constraints and all of the different things that we're trying to respond to. So I'll walk us through kind of our step back and how we first began this work of narrowing down schemes to 2. And then Chelsea will kind of jump in and elaborate on some of the details. So this is a diagram of the existing site as it is currently, highlighting all of the major factors, the largest of which are the track and field, the baseball field, the existing school footprint, and the pool. The red dashed line, the pool's not that large, but it's a sticky one. The red dashed line is representing the Southwest Trails routes, which are also really important to the site. And we understand that in our scope for the project, we're going to be improving those trails. And so we're really looking for ways to sort of integrate them into the site circulation and think about them as they relate to the approaches to the building. But really looking at that existing school footprint, we know that the school is going to be operational during construction. So that is a very large constraint on the eastern part of the site. We also collected feedback from the last couple of meetings that moving the pool is very unlikely, and that keeping it in its current position is beneficial for very many reasons. And so we're going to share 2 options today that keep the pool in its current position. One of the options will keep the track and field in its current position, and one of the options will rotate the track and field to a position similar to the third scheme at the previous meeting. So the first option that we're going to share with you takes the baseball field, which used to be or currently is where this multi-use field is labeled, moves it to the eastern portion of the site. We're keeping the track and field in the same position. The reason we're kind of moving the baseball field over here and putting the multi-use field over here is because it gives us a little bit more breathing room for the buildable area. So you can see the buildable area here outlined in orange is west of the existing footprint, which is still shown dashed there. So we're staying clear of that. We're staying south of the existing pool. Track and field is in its current position, and the multi-use field just barely fits snugly right there. And we'll show you a little bit more development of this scheme, both on the site design as well as the beginning of some interior space planning. I'm going to take one question, and then I think we're going to wait and do questions at the end.
And thanks, I apologize, maybe I missed it at a prior meeting, I had to leave early, but did you already discuss the assumptions that went into the we can't move the pool design consideration?
Thank you for the question. We did not get into very much detail. I think at the last CDW meeting as well as the last CPC meeting, there was a lot of feedback that was left on the boards, concerns about cost, feasibility of moving a pool, disruption to its use year-round, as well as sort of the benefits of having it near the Hillsdale Commercial District. And so, yeah.
And the messy politics of the fact that it isn't actually PPS's pool.
those all went into the decision. PPS, anything more to add on that?
Oh, you got it.
All right.
Okay, thank you.
We
for
can
the
talk more
question.
about that if you have more questions.
But you can see, just kind of highlighting all of the different factors, all of the drivers around the site, there really are quite a few constraints. We call them opportunities, but ways of things that we have to kind of work around in order to get this approximately 300,000 square foot building to fit on this site in a very natural and beautiful way. So we're thinking a lot about pedestrian approach. We know that the connection to Capitol Highway is very important, as is the southern connection from Vermont. And so in this particular arrangement, we think that the entrance to the building on the east side could come off of a really strong north-south axis that is a pedestrian way through the site. That pedestrian way could intersect with the new and improved Southwest trails heading east-west along the north. And that would really be the primary circulation throughout the site. And that's our entrance to the building. For the second option, this is kind of going back to that diagram of the existing conditions. You see the existing school footprint, the pool in its position. The second option, we're looking at rotating the track and field. And when we do that, it opens up a little bit more space in the north-south direction for the school, and in so doing, a little bit more space for a more direct connection, pedestrian connection from Southwest Capitol Highway. And so we'll show you a development of this. This kind of puts the baseball field and the multi-use field, pairs them together on the east part of the site, and the building shape sort of embraces the pool in a sense, and we'll show you some developments on that too. So going back to these diagrams, you've seen them before, gather, lift, and connect. These were really the kind of inspiring concepts that that generated the last three schemes. These were kind of drawn from the guiding principles and the work that we did on Ida B. Wells and who she is and her legacy. So moving forward, yes, we only have 2 ideas, and eventually we'll have 1, but we just want to remind us all that we are still thinking about these big ideas and about Ida B. Wells and her legacy and how they can inform the site design as well as the architecture. So this is a very kind of zoomed out view of scheme 1. So this is the scheme that keeps the track and field in its current position. Obviously the pool is there as well. This building form, kind of similar to the lift scheme previously, is more oriented east-west, and in so doing, we're able to embrace the natural topography of the site, and so the building form starts to sort of step up those berms that you see there currently, and we'll show you a 3D massing of that. The building is sort of oriented around a central common, sort of a long linear common space that is connected to the entries, and that is a great opportunity for views to the west as well as to the east. A new multi-use field, as I mentioned in the diagram, to the west of the building. It keeps the existing track and field with improvements. It keeps the pool. We are showing a new support building in both of these options for the pool, and I think we touched on that last time, but because we are removing the building that is adjacent to the pool that contains services for the pool, we would be replacing those services in some sort of a support building, exact program TBD. But this could be the area for the entry to the pool area as well. A new baseball field, new tennis and pickleball courts. I didn't really mention those in the big diagram, but because they are a little bit smaller, there's a little bit more flexibility with where they go. And so we'd love to hear your feedback on tennis and pickleball. We know we want to have it near parking, but there might be some flexibility with where that goes. And then the entrance, as I mentioned, is accessed off of what would be a pretty strong north-south pedestrian connection. I'm gonna hand it to Chelsea to cover everything I missed.
I don't think you missed very much. That was very good. So as Amelie said, from a site organizational standpoint, with keeping up the track and field and then placing the new school building on the south side of the property, these kind of big elements in the site end up being hugged a little bit more toward that west side, which gives us space for this really strong north-south axis on site. So as folks arrive at the school, they can come in from either side, whether that be Vermont or Capitol, enter into the site, and then they're all sort of funneling in and kind of moving along this same axis toward that front door. So you can see kind of everyone coming in on that same side. Off of that corridor, then a lot of the main activity zones sort of hang off of that, if you will. So you can see the pool, baseball, the school, that tennis. So as you move through that, then you're kind of funnel off wherever you're heading. The way that the site works from a grading perspective is it is highest basically where we are, which is more the eastern part of the site, and it drops away very significantly toward the west. So as you move to the west through the site, there's an opportunity for those pathways to slope down and maybe have series of gathering spots as you sort of move lower along the site toward that multi-use field and some of these kind of outdoor spaces. So there could be a difference in elevation between the main entry, which is on the east side of the building, and then some of those courtyard spaces, which are on the west side of the building. So that gives it a little bit of topography and kind of some interest as you move through the site in that way. I will say a couple of the key features on this one, or sort of extra features, are on this one of the things we are showing is the Southwest Trail is still coming up the pathway between Reiki and Ida B. Wells, and as it was mentioned earlier, that is going to be improved. In this concept, we are keeping it on that northern property line, sort of where it is now. So it's on the north side of the entry drive. So folks who are using that trail either to come to the site or just passing through it, you are staying on the north side of that entry drive. And then also is from a vehicular standpoint, if you're coming on the site, we have parking on both the north and south, kind of toward the eastern side. And this concept does show a potential option of having maybe some kind of drive access that can connect those. That might be only open during certain events or something like that when we want pass-through on the site, but there is that opportunity. One thing you will notice is in this concept, we are not parking it. So it's not like what you see today where you drive down and there's stalls along the whole thing. It would be more like a driveway that kind of brought you down. Part of the reason for that is meeting current code and kind of offsets from property lines, incorporating screening and buffering, but also spatially, some of these elements just take up quite a bit of room and we probably don't have space to cram in parking lots as well. Yes.
It'll be a fast night, I promise. So whenever we see the diagram, we see the dotted line kind of extending to Reiki Elementary, and specifically the Reiki Elementary soccer field and softball field as PPS owned, operated. Has there been any thought as a neighbor with a potential pickleball court in my backyard there to shift pickleball and tennis to some of the lands over by Reiki Elementary? There is a lot of grass space next to that softball field. Can there be any configuration of the open space next to Reiki Elementary to accommodate some of the facilities? We know that the Wells soccer team sometimes practices on Reiki Field, so I already know that some of the high school events take place on Reiki Elementary. So can we open that up as like an overflow area?
At this point, we have not looked at an option for that. That is certainly something that we can look at. Not to be a wet blanket. There is quite a bit of topography here. So there's slope. Sorry, that's my fancy way of saying slope. There's a fairly steep slope on the outside of that softball field. The softball field's kind of carved into it, and it's probably not something that we think about that much unless you're over there being a landscape architect like me and looking at it really closely. But that could be a challenge, but it is certainly something we could look at and consider.
We designed it as an amphitheater, that's why it's that way.
Oh, it would work as a great amphitheater, for sure.
Yeah, we actually got the National Guard to come in and grade it. The neighborhood engaged them, and then the parks agreed to it.
All right.
Is that
Well,
in the
that-
ed spec?
It makes a lot of sense. I like that side.
All that said, we also heard feedback from the last community design workshop that we got like just last week during the ice, and haven't made any updates, but we could look at keeping pickleball more on the northern side where it is now, and I guess where people are more used to hearing it. You can see that the trade-off will be that there'll be a lot less parking on the north side if we do that, and so that'll be something that I would say as we start to put post-it notes up to kind of weigh for yourself whether, how important is it to have that much parking on the north side versus, maybe something else.
Thank you.
Last one.
Okay,
You're my last
and
one.
I heard from people in our community and on our school staff that, and I don't wanna speak for everybody, but that we don't want pickleball. That we want tennis courts, because that's what our athletes play, and there's not a, high school PIL pickleball league, and that there's a story behind why we have pickleball now, but we don't need pickleball moving forward. Just FYI, because that I think is part of the error, the noise, but we don't need pickleball.
And for clarity, we say pickleball, these are sized for tennis.
Good.
And pickleball basically takes up a half a court, they're
Yeah.
smaller. But they are actually sized for tennis, and the idea would be that it would be a multi-purpose courts. All right. So these are some sections, so slice a line through the site. If you can orient yourself, we've got Riki over here on the left, so that's the west. And so looking through the site, there's a couple of sections. So this is the existing conditions just for comparison. So you can see where Ida B. Wells is further on the east side of the site, and you can kind of start to see in section how the site terraces as it slopes down toward Vermont and to the west. So the new school, as you can see, is sliding over to the east or to the west from where it is now, and maybe you can see it. There's sort of a little dash line here. It might be hard to see from the back of the room. There will be some regrading. That's where that existing topography line is, and where we probably are going to end up moving some dirt around, quite a bit of dirt on this site to sort of smooth some things out, because all of those things like the baseball fields, the multi-purpose fields, those have to be level, and so we're going to be doing a fair bit of earthwork to make some of those big program elements fit.
What kind of terrain underneath it? You got any borings to see what we got?
It's in process right now.
It looks like the new building is very close to the old building, plus the whole idea of having to do grading. Will that impact the student experience during construction more than maybe some of the other schemes?
I'd say that you'll see the next scheme, but they're similar in terms of how close they get to the pool to the existing building. In terms of structural and any foundation disruption, we're not concerned there. We're definitely in the clear, but we'll have to definitely come up with a plan for student safety and experience in both ideas. Good question. All right, so this is a zoomed in, I don't even want to call it a floor plan, but we are starting to think about big program elements on the site, because it's a very complex program or a complex list of interior spaces that need to go into the building. The big ones that we're really thinking about that need to be on the main level, really accessible, are the commons, which is what we're showing here, the sort of central bar, the performing arts section. So these dashed lines, the auditorium here is actually about the size of an auditorium, but for the most part, when you see these dashed lines, that is actually just a group of spaces. So it's a zone of a kind of a category of space for the building. So these are approximate locations, but we are looking at the commons location. We are thinking a lot about performing arts, and we're thinking a lot about the athletics and the gyms, because those are really, really big pieces, and we know that they have after hours access and openness to the community depending on time of day. So in this particular scheme, we are showing central commons. This commons actually kind of spans 2 levels. That was just shown in the section that Chelsea walked us through. Because this level here at this lower courtyard is actually about a whole floor below the entry level, there's an opportunity with this building massing to really celebrate that topography change. Of course, there would be elevators, it would be very central and very accessible, but there is an opportunity to really kind of embrace that topography change even on the interior of the building. We're showing the auditorium on the southeast corner next to the main entry, and then athletics, the main gym being actually on that lower level, and it would not be a basement, it would be a fully daylit lower level gym that would have kind of its own zone and its own courtyard access. We're thinking about other ways of configuring this. So this is just the very beginning of thinking about space planning, but for example, you could potentially put athletics closer to the main entry and higher up at the main level, and then you could have a performing arts wing, if you will, that's actually at that lower level that has its accompanying spaces near it with its own entrance on that west side. This is a massing view of this option. So you're seeing here that we're only about 3 levels above the grade, above the ground that it sits on top. And then it starts to step down. There's that gym corner there, and then here's the auditorium right by the entry. It does start to step down with the topography. This is a very diagrammatic massing is what we're calling it. So it's not a building yet, but it gives you an idea for the scale and the size of the building and how it will kind of feel and look on the site. And in a moment, after we go through the next scheme, we will do some we'll share with you some experiential views that would be as if you were looking at it from the street. Gym and athletics, I mentioned its location. We talked a lot about solar orientation last time. So in both of these schemes, you'll see that we have some primary bars, quote unquote bars, that are containing most of the instructional spaces that we're really trying to orient running east-west so that those spaces can have maximum northern and southern sunlight and minimize western sun exposure. And then that central commons that's just very conveniently located near the auditorium and the gym. Scheme 2. So this is the scheme that reorients the track and field. It has a lot in common with the Connect scheme that we reviewed with you last time. The main difference being the pool is still there. So this building form really starts to maximize the space and take advantage of what is left over, for lack of a better word, once you reorient the field and put everything else where it can fit. It's doing a really good job of connecting to Capitol Highway. The central commons in this one, and we'll zoom in just a moment, is very similar to the last scheme in that it's very central. It's associated with the main entry. There's also a secondary entry on this scheme. From this commons, there are views over the track and field. The building form, because it's kind of connecting and sort of spreading its arms to the north as well as the south, there's an opportunity to bring pedestrians down a pedestrian path from the Capitol Highway approach and into that central entrance. The new track and field would be oriented north-south, which we hear is optimal, or we know is optimal. A direct and visible pedestrian approach, I mentioned that. Again, keeping the existing pool and adding a new support building, a new baseball field and multi-use field, and new tennis/pickleball courts.
We'll just call them tennis from now on.
Tennis, no pickleball. I'm gonna hand it to Chelsea.
All right, thank you very much. Hang on, juggling hands. Okay, so one of the big organizational differences in this one, as Amelie was alluding to, is now that the building is sort of placed in the middle of the site, we do have very strong north-south axes and arrival pathways on both sides of the building. So they occur on both the east and the west, and as you can imagine, a lot, or at least we're imagining, folks who are coming from the Capitol Highway side might be more inclined to use that western pathway, whereas those who are coming in from the Vermont side might be more inclined to use that east side pathway. So rather than everyone sort of funneling in on the same path and through the same door, they have the option to come in on both sides and sort of meet in the middle here in the building. So that's going to be a little bit of a difference from an organizational standpoint. Because the track and field is now moving over to that west side, we are going to be pushing our other fields over to the east side. So you're going to see the baseball, which in this case is shifted more up to the northeast corner, so more kind of up in that area where on the previous scheme we showed where there was parking in that zone. And then we can fit in that multi-use field as well. So it's going to be lots of green open on that east side of the site. In addition to that, as we said, we have tennis courts here over on that east side as well. And so you can see all the parking and loading. We'll make, off of Vermont, that's easy access for folks to get to those. And then on the Capitol Highway side has great access to the pool. In this case, because that central part of the building and those two entries on both the east and west, those will be at the same elevation in this one. So we talked about in the other one, the west side courtyard might be lower and the east side would be higher. In this case, they're going to be the same. But what that is going to do is give you kind of an overlook, if you will, toward the track and field, which will sit lower on the site. And I'll show you a section in a minute, so that will be a little more clear. But essentially, when you're up at the school, you're going to be looking out and able to see out over that track and field, that stadium. In this one, we do have a little bit of change for that southwest trail. So as you come in through the site, it's actually the same as it comes along the pathway between Reiki and Ida B. But in this case, it stays along the south side of that entry drive and doesn't cross over to Burlingame until it's past the driveway. So there's maybe a little less having to cross over vehicular moments for that trail. It also can become a nice route in for folks who are walking in from Capitol Highway and kind of coming to the school, whether you're coming to one of those other pathways. Yes.
Tiny ears, we really should.
Yes, so much trouble.
For dominant wind direction, I may have a high schooler who's on the track and cross country team, and when I told him I was celebrating this third option and how the track would be reoriented, and I was pretty pumped about this one actually. He's like, Dad, all the wind hits us already, I think, out of the southwest. And so, is there any data on prevailing wind direction when you put the track completely exposed to a down gradient and open to the wind and the elements?
That's a good question. We'll have to look at it. We might just need.
What event does your son on?
He's middle and long distance. So.
He's
He'll
good
be fine
too.
then. It's a sprinter issue.
Okay.
Yeah, if you're sprinting, you just want it at your back, and then you're fine.
I wouldn't say we've dug that far in yet, but it's something that we're starting to look at. And should this be an option that we continue forward, I mean, we'll want to dig into that some more.
Yeah, I'm afraid that a lot of the literature focuses on things like soccer and football and baseball, where you have an athlete with a ball flying at them and they need to see it and don't lose in the light. The track and field folks, you are on your own. So let's see. I don't think parking in this one. Yes, thank you. So I got distracted. So in this one, we do have parking on both the north and south sides. One of the changes in this one is we don't show an ability to sort of connect them to. So that's something that you might have feedback on, whether you think that is important or not. One of the other things that you might see here is on the north side, as this was drawn, we are showing parking and then also maybe a secondary small zone for drop-off. It does reduce the total number of stalls as drawn in this drawing. However, we have already studied it and know that we could actually equalize parking in both schemes. So if this is interesting to you, we'd love your feedback on it, but we don't want it to be a driver for not liking anything about this concept, because we could fix it if you feel like it needs more parking. So this again is the section. So again, up top, you're looking at that existing condition of the school site, and then down below, you're seeing that shift. So you're seeing the high school more moved to the middle a little bit more. That multi-use field is being cut through here, and then you can really see and get a feel for how that overlook is going to be from the west side entrance, and how you're going to be sitting up high above the stadium. So you're going to be able to see out and into it and over it toward that west side. And you can really see how the seating for the stadium could even be dug into that hillside, into that terrace, and kind of make that sort of transition.
Paper floors will be a press box.
Yeah.
Yes. All right.
Question.
Yes.
On the previous slide, you have pedestrian access on the east side. On the previous slide. over here.
Oh, over here, yes, there could be a pathway, but it wouldn't be vehicular in this case, so it could be pathways to move around the site. Thank you for catching that.
Okay, so a zoom in of this one. The interior organization is actually very similar, just with the addition of some 90-degree angles. So we are still looking at some primary bars that are running east-west on the site. They're a little shorter because the plan isn't quite as compact. But then this arm to the north is the athletics wing, if you will, with the main gym, again, on the lower level, but it's completely at grade with the approach and the parking lot from the north. And then the performing arts would be on this wing, right at the main entry from Vermont Street. So that's the basic organization of the plan on this one. And then the massing model of this, similar aside from the 90-degree turns, but this is showing those those primary east-west bars running east-west. I didn't mention on the last one either, but in both, we are showing that like kind of long linear central commons as a single story space. It would be generous, like 20 feet, I think is what we're showing here. It would be very generous and spacious, but by keeping it one level, we allow for more daylight and more views out of the classroom, the instructional spaces that are up above. It also makes for an interesting form. So we're playing with that as a sort of a building block right now, but this will continue to evolve. I think that's pretty much it regarding the massing. Shade studies. I bet everyone's wondering about the pool and whether or not it's going to be too shady. We think no, and so we're showing you 3 different slides here. This first set of slides is showing 9 a.m., 2 p.m., and 7 p.m. on June 1st. So this is the aerial view of the building, and here's the pool here. So you can see this little sliver of shade here at 9 a.m., a slightly larger sliver at the southern portion of the pool deck at 2, and then a kind of north-south linear shade block to the east of that gym building at 7 p.m., which is about an hour before closing, I think. And then on July 1st, it's not much different. And then on August 15th, it is still fully sunned, a little bit more of a shadow at 2 p.m. on the southern end, and then a little bit more coverage once you get to 7 p.m. at the end of summer on August 15th. But you can see here the blue fields indicating the actual water are still primarily unshaded.
Question.
Yes.
So there's been at least 3 attempts in my lifetime to put a cover on that pool. Is it possible that you can consider a retractable cover, because people like the outdoor aspect of it as part of your design? And the second issue relates to, there was a huge amount of citizen activism, child activism, to actually put hot water solar panels. Thank you.
There was a whole lot of activism about 10 or 15 years ago to put solar panels on the roof to heat the water for the pool. I don't even know if they're functional today, but is that something you're considering? It's not an issue that right now. I think it ought to be something you think about and respond to people.
Just want to remind folks, it's the parks that owns the pool and not PPS.
I know that fully.
So I was just gonna
So
say,
it becomes something where it becomes their responsibility.
if Parks wants to come in and put a retractable roof, I think PPS would probably be willing to talk with them about what that would look like. And if Parks wants to come in and put in a solar hot water, then they can do that. But
There is
we
one
do
now.
not,
There is one now.
There is one.
Do you want me to talk about
yeah.
He looked at the solar hot water.
Yeah, we did. We were poking around with our. We have a pool consultant, and the system is still functional. He said that it is likely not that helpful because the demand for hot water is least when there's the most sun. So it may be more valuable actually if it were repurposed or rethought of to heat the shower. There's always demand for shower hot water, but heating the pool water, the demand is out of sync with when we have the most sun.
Or put PV in lieu of.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we are putting that pool support building up there, and it will have a roof, so we can look at what as we're talking with Portland Parks about what we need to put in that pool support building for the changing rooms, and those are gonna require restrooms and showers. I mean, we'll obviously look at that, but I think it's really important for us to all understand that that is not PPS's building, and that PPS and the school board and the bond that will likely come that's just not part of what PPS feels like they can take responsibility for.
Well, if there were a cover on it, they could use it for construction during the year.
Yeah, that takes it from an existing pool to a new pool, and those go into like hundreds of millions of dollars by the time you're done. So, like, hey, you know, it'd be great if that's what we could do, but that is probably outside the scope of what this project can do. Have I overstepped on that, Donna and Eric?
That's
Well,
correct.
maybe not the hundreds of millions,
Yeah,
but
but
still.
tens of millions.
Yeah, so
But,
that's a lot.
you know, that, we still have to look at it.
Yeah.
Okay, one more thing about this scheme, and then we can go into some street views to look at how this feels from the street. We've talked a lot about solar orientation and trying to run things east-west and avoiding long frontages that are west-facing. In this case, our bars that are have a little bit more western exposure do not need as much glazing. Definitely in the case of the performing arts, where that little nook right there would be the auditorium space, and so there are no windows going into that space. On this side, this is the gym. We could certainly minimize windows on the west and create much better openings and much larger openings on the north and even potentially on the east side. So that's the way we're kind of thinking and getting around that issue with these ideas. So this is that massing model, but in street view. So it's not an architecture yet, but it gives you an idea about the size and the feel and what the approach might be like. So this is scheme one. This is the two bars that keeps the track and field in its position, in its current position. This is a view from Vermont Street from the southeast. And this is scheme two, that same exact view. So this is the one with the auditorium on the south that I was well, they both have the auditorium in approximate this location, but this is the one with the 90-degree angles. So you can see just kind of toggling back and forth. They're very, very similar in terms of impact and scale on the site. This is a view from the Capitol Highway approach. So this is the ballet school right here to the right. This is the grandstand that exists, and this is the retaining wall holding up the track and field. So this is scheme one. If the track and field were to remain in its current position, this is what the building would look like beyond as you approach from Capitol. This is scheme two. So if the track and field is not in that position and it's over here, you'd be able to see the pathway and that approach, that pedestrian connection to that secondary entrance that Chelsea described. And then finally, this is another view from Vermont, but this time from the southwest approach. So this is the very tip of southeast corner of Reiki right here. And this is that drive into the Reiki parking lot. So this is scheme one looking east. And this is scheme two. And we did some energy models too. Corey, do you want to talk about these briefly?
All right. So I got the question last time when we were looking at three schemes, which is how do the three perform on energy? My answer at that point was it depends. It mostly depends on where the windows are placed in relation to the building. But for this, since we're a little bit more developed, I took a stab at running some energy models. So I can show this first. So this is scheme one. Just so you understand how to read these diagrams, we have one for each set. Over on your right, we have cooling energy, and there's a scale from red is higher cooling energy, blue is lower cooler energy, so that major spaces in the building show that gradient. And then we have heating energy on the left, where blue is high heating energy. Oops, because it's colder, and then low heating energy in yellow. So where you're going to see the areas with the higher cooling energy is again on the south and west. So like this classroom and this kind of walkway from one side to the other side would be areas that require more cooling energy. While the areas with less cooling energy on this scheme are the more buried spaces, right? The ground floor, the north side. In terms of heating energy, anything with windows to the south is going to get more solar gain during the winter, and that's going to offset heating energy. Looking at the next scheme, again on the west, specifically the southwest, of these spaces are going to be potentially warmer and require more cooling, similar to the walkway, just as the other scheme. And also the south-facing classrooms would require less heating energy. So they're a little bit warmer in the winter. And now again, warmer, the temperature will be the same because we'll have systems, but the natural kind of solar heating would supplement, requiring less energy. So again, super early, lots of assumptions made on which spaces are where, how big those spaces are, just placing a reasonable amount of glazing throughout. And this first scheme is looking at about 13% less energy than scheme 2. But again, it's very possible that both schemes, depending on how we develop them further, could perform different energy. But this is, I think, useful just to get an idea that the reason buildings use more or less heating and cooling energy has to do with, again, the orientation that we discussed, and then different parts of the building will use energy in different ways in different seasons. All right. Yep.
Okay, so in summary, and then I'm gonna hand it over to Steffi. We've seen all of this already, but we've got scheme 1 keeps track and field in its current position. Scheme 2 reorients it, relocates it north-south. Both are keeping the pool. Both have a pool support building that needs to be added. And in general, they have a lot of similarities. So these similarities here are grayed out, just so I don't have to bore you with my voice more. But they're a little bit different in just the way, how compact they are. This one is really kind of embracing the grade and stepping up in its form. This one clearly is making more of a gesture to the Capitol Highway approach. And then Steffi's gonna talk through some trade-offs.
Yeah.
I'll try to get all some of it here, but in one of the earlier planning meetings, there was talk about how to offset some of the western exposure. And in scheme 2, moving the field, one of the guiding ideas behind that was to maximize the views, if I'm remembering everything correctly. And if cutting the gym exposure to the views to make sure that you're not getting too much heat in, is there alternatives like the overhangs that were discussed earlier that can still maximize the view that
So what we've really tried to do with both schemes actually is for areas like the commons and walkways, those are the areas that really get the views because they can handle having maybe a little bit of glare. But all the classroom spaces and learning spaces, we've tried to make sure that they open either to the north or the south and they don't have the glare. So we're trying to say views are for where everybody is, common spaces, walkways, and then we really get the best light on areas that are learning spaces, and we try to keep those north-south. So in the gym, we might be able to get some views, but even in the gyms, you don't want to have all that many windows because you've got lots of
floors.
Yes, there's that too, and you've got, so no matter what we do, we really want to be careful of the light in the gym. We tend to focus light in gyms and overheads, which is why they tend to not have things over the top of them too. So I hope that answered your question. We also can plant some trees and there can be some shade. Those are some of the passive strategies that we can use to mitigate some of those areas where the sunlight comes in, but we're really trying to say that areas that can have views and can handle glare get some western exposure, and those areas that shouldn't, we try to keep in a north-south. So you will see that there's a board at the end of each of these that is basically this slide. And you can tell that both of these schemes have some really positive parts, and they both have some parts where we're gonna have to evaluate and think about the trade-offs. So what we're really seeing with these schemes is that in terms of general building cost and site cost, scheme 1, because it's gonna do less on the site and it has a bit more of a compact building, is going to have a smaller cost. It's not, in the big scheme of things, it's a relatively small amount, but even a few percentage points of, $300 million-ish project is going to be tens of millions of dollars. So these are significant, and we just want to make sure we keep those in mind. Also, because Scheme 2 is reorienting the track and field, the duration that track will be out of commission and the duration of that construction will be a little bit longer as well, at least for the site work. The building might be about the same, but the site work will take longer. So on this side, you'll see we have some really light arrows that says this one has a bit of an advantage when it comes to project costs and schedule duration. When it comes to connection to Capitol Highway, this one has a better connection to Capitol Highway. I mean, just because we're able to open that up. I do want to put a caveat here for those of you who are working in schools and or who come to schools and you don't know where you're going. If the main entrance, we still want to have one main entrance, and it's still assumed to be over here where the parking is. So that secondary entrance, we're going to have to be very careful that during parts of the day where maybe that entrance isn't open, that we have good signage and we really are directing people to the right entrance. And so I just want to make sure you're aware that we really try to have only one entrance on a school. And so even a secondary entrance has some operational impacts for the school itself. This one definitely has an improved track and field for its longer term operation in terms of its optimal orientation. But this one doesn't have that 3-year disruption to the track and field program. So that's a criteria, and how do we weigh that? This option also does provide that ability for someone who comes in, doesn't find a parking spot, to be able to drive to the other side, or for PPS maintenance vehicles, and to not put all of the impact on the Reiki cross through. That was something that got kind of mixed reviews, so we're really interested in how you would weigh that criteria in terms of success. This option is able to get better parking near both sides of the building. This option, really because of the way it slopes down the hill, is really challenged to get parking to the other end of the building. That doesn't mean that we can't have an accessible entrance that walks down the hill, but for someone who for whom moving is not as easy as it is maybe for other people, that could be an impact because parking will be a bit further away. And then finally, for those of us who care about loading, this one right now has just a little bit more room and flexibility for loading just because of that 90-degree turn that it has. It's got a little bit of an area. This one's kind of more pushed up against Vermont. It's just a little bit more compressed. So from an operational, for those of you who are in the school and you think about those sorts of things, that's just one where there's a different advantage. Yeah?
And apologies if this was embedded in one of those. For pickup and drop off for like sports teams, in addition to parent and guardian pickup and drop off, does Scheme 2 kind of push the onus for ingress and egress, or you're a sports team in a big bus, to Capitol Highway versus the neighborhood in Vermont? Can I read that into that?
I don't think that we've given that full consideration. Okay. To see if there is, something that's more feasible on the Vermont side. Certainly you can see how this Vermont slopes down, and there may be an ability to have some drop off there in combination with loading. I just don't know that we've really given that its full consideration. Chelsea, do you want to add to that?
I was going to say, in both schemes, we actually are showing space for some bus drop-off on the Vermont side. That is in part because there are some school buses that do bring some children to the school, and we want to make sure they are being dropped off close to the front door. And so there would be an ability for that kind of drop-off there. We have not done a full study of exactly how many visiting teams we have to accommodate, but presumably they may be able to use that as well.
Yeah.
Super quick one.
Yeah, no problem.
Can you speak about addressing the grandstands in either of those? I know someone had mentioned the current ones are kind of end of life, so how would that be replanned, and if we want with Scheme 2, would those be blocking anyway?
Great question. So on Scheme 1 right now, we're showing the future grandstands in the same location. We're assessing right now the structural integrity and what it will take to bring them up to current code. So we can't definitively say that they're actually at the end of their life and that it would be the most cost-effective solution to replace them, so we're assessing that. Should we need to replace them, we will at that point have to decide whether or not it's worthwhile to try and relocate them to the other side of the field, but then that has other implications for the configuration of the track and field and the straightaways. So we'll have to give that some thought once we have that information. As it relates to the grandstands here, as Chelsea noted, and I think Amelie as well, we can use the site topography to actually create some grandstands into the site. We'll have fabulous views looking straight into the setting sun. But there's also the opportunity, much like if you've been to like Franklin's site, for us to maybe use some of the outer topography, for those times of the year when it is hot and it is sunny, and you want an alternative place to sit. But if we could, we'd have the grandstands on the east side, and in this side, that's just not going to be feasible to put them on that side. It just wouldn't really make a lot of sense. That's where we're at right now. I mean, can't say that we've considered every option yet, but as we're looking at these schemes, questions like this really help us think about maybe what we haven't considered yet, or what is more important. How should we weigh some of these different criteria. Yeah, I'm in school right now. I have to make sure I try and get some of that right. Yes, Don?
Good question.
Yeah.
I assume we have new lighting on either case for the football field. Is there any plan to light the baseball field?
Yes, and all of these schemes, we're putting turf on the baseball field and the softball field and adding lights and fencing to both of them.
And then it would be down-facing lights as opposed to this kind of light.
We thought we'd aim them right at the neighbors, but I guess we could make them face, yeah. They're actually really good lighting technology now that really minimizes the amount of light that shines outside the site, so it's not the kind of impact it used to be, and we keep it really directed inside. Sorry for my sarcasm. David?
Oh, I was just gonna say, we had that issue with Grant recently when we put the softball field in, and there was a lot of concern, but the new lighting is so amazing that it really hasn't been an issue.
When the lighting on the current field was given, there was only one neighbor that supported it. The whole neighborhood was opposed. And it hasn't been that big a deal, but it is a bright light out there.
Yeah, it is. So that is the plan, is to have them both turfed and with lighting.
Softball field as well.
Softball field as well. If we turf the baseball field, we turf the softball field.
And the reason that I'm interested is we'd like to have that arena so we could have activity there rather than just softball.
Yeah, that amphitheater, we'll get that into the ed spec. Just kidding. No, we'll take a look at what we can do there. Yeah.
I'm sorry if this has been mentioned, the red dotted line on both schemes, I'm assuming is security fencing?
Yes, we've tried to note that as secure a bowl perimeter. It doesn't mean that those gates will be closed all the time. That just means that we are starting to make sure that we have a perimeter that can have a security perimeter. And that is one of the things that, as we look at the access through the site, we'll look at, especially on this scheme too. You'll see that we have that securable perimeter here in hopes of not having someone at a time when that secondary entrance isn't open, coming all the way here only to find the door locked and then try and figure out how they're gonna walk all the way around. So we wanna make sure we don't take, in our attempt to make an improved situation, actually make an even worse situation.
So I have a lot of years of experience at Franklin and how unsecure that campus is in terms of fencing, so I hope we've learned from that.
We're trying.
Yeah.
So, this exact slide is over there on the boards, and what we'd really like you to do is to comment on these criteria as we're going through the next set of exercises. We want you to spend some time first thinking on your own, writing down on the post-it notes on your table what you feel like some of those trade-offs are, successes and challenges like we've been doing, but then go put post-it notes on the boards, see what other people are posting, talk to each other, ask questions. We'll be around to also talk with you and answer questions if we can. And then the last thing is that there is that survey on the table where you've tried to understand what some of the potential trade-offs might be, and it's really helpful if you can not put two, like I don't know if I want to be on this side or the other, so I'm going to circle them both. We really want you to challenge yourself to pick one side or the other. Because what we really are trying to get at is if you have to pick one side or the other, what would you pick? What is your priority, and what is the trade-off that you think that PPS and the design team should prioritize? We have only about half an hour for this because we've had some great questions, so we've used some of that time for that. We can stay just a little bit longer if we need to, but we want to be respectful of everyone's time.
Stephanie, are there more of these, or you just want one per table?
If I can pass around surveys to anyone who did not get one, if you raise your hand. I can collect them as well.
Yeah, before you leave, make sure you hand them to someone on the design team or the PPS team so that we can compile the data.
You guys
Great.
did a great job. Really